History TV, all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 3. Next on American History TV, researcher Peter Kornbluh discusses President Kennedy's attempts to open up private channels of communication with Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion. He describes the people tasked with the operation and the issues involved with establishing reliable dialogue and negotiations. Mr. Kornbluh is the co-author of Back Channel to Cuba. He spoke at a conference marking the 50th anniversary of the release of the Warren Report, hosted by the Assassination Archives and Research Center. This is about 45 minutes.
Thank you, and I am here to introduce Peter Kornbluh, who I have just met, and excuse me, I have to go here, and have just gotten a copy of his new book, which is coming out on October the 1st on Wednesday. So I don't think you can buy them here yet. Is that correct?
Here,
I'm sorry,
Wednesday.
but your local bookstores will all have, and Amazon, I presume, will have that. Thank you. My name is Brenda Brody, and I've been on the board since 2005, and Jim and I can't identify the exact year, so that's as close as I can get. The National Security Archive, Peter Kornbluh's home base, was, I believe, the first organization to be known publicly as NSA. I just want to clarify that his organization is what I call the good NSA. The NSA I call the other NSA is the National Security Agency, and they're the ones who listen to our private phone calls and read our mail, and are a core component of our secret government that has for decades done everything possible to fight FOIA suits and deny legitimate requests for access to their historic records. Peter Kornbluh and his good NSA, as well as the Assassination Archives Research Center, of course, has for decades been in the forefront of filing requests and occasionally legal suits to obtain declassification and release of highly classified and hidden documents. The role of both the good NSA and AARC is chasing our historic records, relentlessly trying to pry open the hidden hands of the bad NSA and CIA and most of the covert agencies, and more frequently now, unfortunately, our national archives, that continue to veil public records behind layers of classification and secrecy. Peter Kornbluh has been responsible for two major projects at the good NSA and has managed to extract substantive records for both. This is my definition of a hero. He's obtained vital records of the Nixon-Kissinger overthrow of the first Chilean government in 1973, and his book on that topic several years ago was entitled The Pinochet File, a Declassified Dossier on Atrocity and Accountability. The documents read like the outline for a Le Carré novel to me, and he's also obtained many of the documents generated during, before, and after some of the U.S. attempts to overthrow the Cuban government. In 1998, he wrote a book that was a page-turner for researchers that was entitled The Bay of Pigs Declassified, the Secret Report of the Invasion of Cuba. And here's the sequel coming out. Soon to be, I presume, brought also to television screens and the big screen. Whoops. And though it took years, he's extracted 4 of the 5 volumes of the most important history of the development of Cuban-American history, politics, policy, strategies, propaganda, and cyber that led to the disaster that was the Bay of Pigs. This history was written by Jack Pfeiffer, a CIA historian who has had access to many, but nowhere near all, of the documents generated by key CIA components and the groups and consultants from all branches of government that they worked with. What was most fascinating to me is that these volumes confirm that the most important decisions about the development of U.S. attempts to oust Fidel and supply a U.S.-approved government to replace him, some of the most important were made by a small group of top officers within CIA, most working from Angleton shops, from the Navy and elsewhere in the Pentagon. Here we go. And many key decisions were taken without the knowledge of either President Eisenhower or Kennedy. By the late 70s, I'd been cramming on Cuban history for almost 20 years and came across the man I've spent more time with than my husband or my children. His name was William Pauly. I've gotten to know him probably better than either of his wives or any of the other women in his life. I learned he was an inveterate liar, cheat, thief, fraud, draft dodger, traitor, and much more, and a brilliant con man who sold Chiang Kai-shek his Air Force, was connected to airline activity through Latin America, and then became ambassador to first Peru and then Brazil, and used his titles to meet, greet, and squeeze some of the important, very rich men everywhere. He played his connections on cash with very top Republicans, including President Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers, to get himself up to his propellers in top-level planning. He was very deeply involved in CIA's plan to overthrow the first Democratic-elected government in Guatemala, but President Truman seems to have pulled up the CIA short, and it was held over until the Dulles brothers arrived with the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, and Pauly was welcome in the lighthouse. Like most people, like most people here, here we go, hold on. Like most people here, I also am totally dependent on documents. And it wasn't until Peter Kornbluh unearthed and dug out and obtained Volume 4 of the 5-volume set of historical commentaries on the Bay of Pigs, written by CIA historian Jack Pfeiffer, did I confirm the extraordinarily powerful positions Pauly held and the roles he played in the counterintelligence operations leading up to and during the Bay of Pigs. These volumes are gold mines for everyone with any historical interest from the end of World War II to now. And mind you, in these volumes, it's clear that Dr. Pfeiffer had materials withheld from him, that he recognized some places where he was played by his managers and others where he was deliberately lied to. This is probably why CIA continues to refuse to turn over Volume 5 to Peter Kornbluh, the good NSA, and the ARC and the rest of us. If you believe that they refuse to release it because it's just a draft, which is what they say it is, there are pages in these same volumes, 5 volumes, that are stamped draft, and there are any number of other records elsewhere, draft, that have been declassified and released. What are they hiding? Another former CIA historian has recently attacked Pfeiffer in what sures to be an attempt to diminish Volume 5 in the event it's ever to be released. Contrary to rumors floating that Pfeiffer was a CIA sycophant, I don't think so. Volume 4 makes it pretty clear that Pfeiffer realized and made clear that he knew damn well some of what was withheld from him, and he didn't think it was pretty. Let's everyone here give Peter Kornbluh and Jim Lazar the present they deserve for working so long and so hard for all of us, and send letters to NARA asking them why they are ceding to CIA requests that Volume 5 should not be declassified and released. We do know that this is accurate because NARA actually sent a letter to Jim that says so. So with nothing further, Peter is going to now talk about what happened from the document's viewpoint in Cuba.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be known as the good NSA. That's as opposed to the bad NSA. We realize that the name of our organization, when it's reduced to an acronym and its initials, is very confusing. And many people out in the world hear National Security Archive and they believe that we are the library of the CIA. And I have to go around telling audiences that we are the antithesis of the librarians or archivists of the CIA. We're the good NSA, and we have a revolutionary slogan, documents or death. And that distinguishes me rather quickly from anybody thinking that I'm an undercover CIA person posing as an archivist. I'm going to talk about we're going to talk about the Bay of Pigs volume and the efforts to get that material declassified through a little question and answer between me and Brenda in a few minutes. But what I wanted to talk about this morning is the chapter on Kennedy in the new book, Back Channel to Cuba, and Kennedy's back channels to Cuba. I think you'll find, although some of you are familiar with the contours of this history, I think you'll find that the book contains more details than any other place on this rather fascinating history. You know, the Kennedy assassination, of course, has intrigued us all. It intrigues me as a historian of U.S.-Cuban relations for many, many reasons, one of which is that this hidden history of Kennedy's efforts to reach out to Fidel Castro is so counter to the kind of known image of him of giving the green light to the Bay of Pigs invasion, of pushing through his brother for Operation Mongoose, et cetera, et cetera. And so the flip side of the coin, what National Security Council documents refer to as the sweet approach, has always intrigued me. But of course, the most intriguing thing about the Kennedy assassination is a historical coincidence, although I know there are people in the room that don't think it's a coincidence, of the very moment that John F. Kennedy was killed. The very moment that he was killed, there was a CIA officer in Paris meeting with a high-level mole inside the Cuban military and attempting to pass him a poison pen to assassinate Fidel Castro. And at that very same moment, John F. Kennedy had an emissary in Cuba, a French journalist, meeting with Jean Daniel, a French journalist named Jean Daniel, meeting with Fidel Castro at a safe house in Veradero Beach, having lunch with him, fresh fish brought by the fishermen for them, and an aide comes in and says, "Turn on the radio, the president has been shot in Dallas." And the mission of Jean Daniel to pass what he called a message of peace from John F. Kennedy to Fidel Castro was aborted at that very moment. So it's an intriguing set of circumstances that certainly calls on us to think through what really happened. For many, many years, almost 30 years, the Jean Daniel story was the only story that was really known about Kennedy's efforts to approach Castro. He wrote about it in the New York Times only a few weeks after Kennedy was killed. He had a front-page story. He also wrote a two-part article in the New Republic in which he detailed his role as a special envoy. But over the course of time, we were able to get a Kennedy administration file declassified. It was called Special Contacts with Cuban Leaders. And it revealed a whole set of efforts to reach out and communicate with Castro about changing the contours of U.S.-Cuban relations in the wake of the very dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis. And let me just go back to, of course, what we all remember, the political climate of the day. We had the Bay of Pigs invasion. We had the trade embargo in its aftermath. We had Robert Kennedy overseeing Operation Mongoose and assassination attempts and all sorts of coordinated pressures. And of course, then there were just the famous efforts to overthrow Fidel Castro. But interesting enough, out of these efforts of aggression came the first opportunities for actual contact and a kind of a rebuilding of the broken bridges, the destroyed bridges in U.S.-Cuban relations. Publicly, we had an overt and covert nastiness against Cuba, particularly in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. But in the aftermath of the missile crisis, some of Kennedy's aides noted that the missile crisis ended badly for Fidel Castro and his relationship with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union pulled the missiles out of Cuba without actually consulting him. He had been willing to sacrifice his whole country for the socialist bloc and their right to defend themselves. And here, Nikita Khrushchev hadn't even talked to him before agreeing with Kennedy that he would secretly swap the missiles in Cuba for U.S. missiles in Turkey. And so the issue was whether Fidel would be so angry at the Soviets, and he was very angry at them, that we might seize that opportunity and entice him to come back to us. And there was a shift in Kennedy's thinking, and it was helped by the fact that he started negotiations, secret negotiations with the Cubans to free the Bay of Pigs prisoners. I went to McGeorge Bundy and interviewed him just, I don't know, 5 or 6 months before he passed away in the mid or late 1990s. And I asked him, you know, why did Kennedy reach out to the Cubans? And he said, well, you know, there was this breach with the Soviet Union. Kennedy was a smart guy. He thought he could explore bringing Cuba back into the Western orbit, and he wanted to see what could be done. But as Bundy said, you know, we had no department of peaceful tricks. We only had a department of dirty tricks. The issue was how do you do this? You know, what mechanism, since it was too politically sensitive to actually have an open meeting with Fidel Castro, how did you do this? And the answer became through the man who was negotiating the release of the Bay of Pigs, of the more than 1,000 Bay of Pigs prisoners, James Donovan, the famous New York lawyer. And Donovan conducted what Kissinger would later call shuttle diplomacy. He kept flying back and forth from Miami to Havana, meeting with Castro, starting in the early fall of 1962, a break in the action during the missile crisis, and then a flurry of shuttle diplomacy in December of 1962, which resulted in a trade of $62 million of food and medicines for the actual prisoners. And at the very moment that the prisoners were being loaded onto a series of planes at Christmas Eve, the CIA called up Donovan and said, you know, we have 3 agents in Castro's jails, 3 American agents from the Technical Services Division. They had been planting eavesdropping devices in the ceiling of the new China news agency that was being built in Havana. Wayne Smith remembers this because he was there when they were arrested. You know, they bungled the whole operation. They rented an apartment above the actual agency, and they were just drilling holes in the ceiling and planting these devices, and the Cubans were onto them and arrested them, threw them in jail. And there were about 25 other Americans who'd been rounded up after the revolution for counter-subversion activities, and they were in Cuban jails also. And the CIA basically said to Donovan, get all these guys out. And Donovan said, well, you release these prisoners along with the Bay of Pigs prisoners. And Castro said, no, but if you come back in January, we can start to talk about that. And that really was the beginning of talks between Cuba and the United States under the Kennedy administration. Donovan came back in January, he came back in March, he came back in April to negotiate the release of these Americans. Castro thought they were all CIA agents as far as he was concerned. 3 of them actually were bona fide CIA agents. And eventually, Donovan arranged a prisoner swap for Cubans who had been arrested here in the United States, including one who had by accident shot a 9-year-old girl in the back and killed her and had been convicted and put in jail in New York, for about 27 U.S. citizens in Cuban jails, 3 of whom were the CIA agents. And it was in the middle of these talks, as they culminated, that Castro said, how would we restore normal relations with the United States of America? And Donovan said to him, Mr. Premier, do you know how porcupines make love? And Castro turned to his translator, René Vallejo, and said, Puercoespinos haciendo el amor? ¿Qué es eso? Porcupines making love? What the hell is that? And he said, the answer was no, he didn't know how they made love. And Donovan said, very carefully. And that is how you in the United States will begin to discuss restoring relations. I will help and do the best that I can with that. And Donovan came back with this message that Kennedy was interested, that Castro was interested in better relations. And, curiously, the bureaucracy then kind of went into overdrive for instructions for him. They wanted him to go back to Cuba and tell Castro that if he severed his relationship with the Soviet Union and he made it clear that he was pulling all of his agents out of the rest of Latin America, then we could talk to him about better relations. And this proposal for these instructions were brought to the President of the United States. And this document, I think, is probably the key document. When I found this document in the Kennedy Library, I felt that it was clearly the most important document of the Kennedy administration from March of 1963, with the President of the United States overruling his aides on these restrictive instructions and basically saying, look, we want to have better relations with a guy. Don't give him a set of preconditions that he's not going to meet. Let's be more flexible on this. And by the way, I'm damn interested in making this happen. So let's go forward. And it's quite an interesting document. There was an aide in the National Security Council who really deserves tremendous credit, Gordon Chase. He personally wanted to see better relations with Cuba, and he kept peppering Bundy, his boss, with these wonderful memos, and then Bundy would pass these on in the high-level meetings with the President. And basically, Bundy concluded, as he told the President, that a Titoist Castro is not inconceivable, and a full diplomatic revolution would not be the most extraordinary event in the 20th century. As he put it, Castro or others currently high in the regime might find advantage in a gradual shift away from their present level of dependence on Moscow. And the United States and Cuba, on strictly economic terms, have much to gain from reestablishment of relations. And so, at the very highest levels, even though the 90% of the national security bureaucracy was certainly against this, some feelers started to go forward. This is the pivotal memo that Gordon Chase wrote, where he basically said, we haven't really we've explored the covert nastiness and the overt pressures, but we haven't explored the sweet approach that might entice Castro back to us. He had this whole PR plan. It won't be a headline that the U.S. accommodates with Castro. It'll be, Castro ejects Soviet Union from Western Hemisphere. U.S. pulls Cuba back into Western orbit. This was the kind of headline and spin that he put on it. James Donovan passed the baton of being an intermediary to an extraordinary reporter from ABC News. It was a woman named Lisa Howard. Does anybody in the room actually remember seeing her on television in the early 60s? She was the most famous female journalist of her time. She was the first female correspondent for ABC News. She was the first female to have her own news show. She's been called the first Barbara Walters because her whole scheme, just like Barbara's, was to find powerful world leaders and interview them and make a lot of headlines with that. And her first major interview was with Nikita Khrushchev, 1960, when he came to the UN. And then she set her sights on Fidel Castro and began peppering the Cuban mission in New York to let her go to Cuba with a camera crew and interview Fidel. Fidel had not given any major interviews to American television since 1959. This was now 1963. And she finally got permission to go in April of 63. And then, of course, as Wayne Smith will tell you, and anybody else who's tried to see Castro, it's hard to get to him. And finally, after being there and waiting for 3 weeks, she went to Donovan, who was there on his last trip, and said, please broker an introduction. And he went to Castro and he said, Mr. Premier, there's a beautiful blonde dish of a reporter wanting to see you. I highly recommend that you spend some time with her. And Castro gave her this interview the night before he flew off to Moscow for a month to restore his relations with the Soviet Union. And he also spent some time talking to her privately. And when she came back, she shared what he said privately with, of course, the CIA. They were waiting for her at the airport in Miami when she landed. They debriefed her, and they immediately sent a memo. Richard Helms, who figures in all of our discussions at this conference, immediately sent a memo to the president. If you look up in the corner there, it would be to your right, where the little handwritten PSAW is. That was the mark that Kennedy's secretary wrote on every document that he actually saw, President saw. And in the original document, it's in blue ink, and it's quite striking. And this is the debriefing report from Lisa Howard, and she made it clear. Fidel Castro really feels that we could have better relations with the he could have better relations with the United States. We need an intermediary. I will volunteer to do this, or James Donovan could do it, or Adlai Stevenson could do it, but he's willing to work on this. And that was his first feeler. Now, this document, how many of you have seen this document before? One, two. Jeff Morley's seen it. Anybody else? Well, this document, of course, is fodder for some of the issues of motivation when it comes to the CIA and Kennedy. Of course, the CIA opposed this idea of a rapprochement with Cuba, and John McCone made his feelings about it felt immediately. The memo to Kennedy on Lisa Howard went the day before this one, on May 1st, and on May 2nd, as McCone was leaving the country, he called his office and issued an edict. Send everybody in the White House this one-paragraph letter saying we don't like this idea because it's going to, if it ever leaked, it would undermine everything that we've been working towards in Latin America. You know, all the exiles we work with would accuse us of betrayal. The Latin American countries who we've been bribing and pressuring to distance themselves from Cuba would call us hypocrites. The whole kit and caboodle of our approach. So don't go there. But you know, over the course of time, key officials, William Atwood, who was a deputy UN ambassador, Lisa Howard, worked with the Cuban ambassador at the UN to start passing messages back and forth. And finally, Lisa Howard got impatient, and she organized what I call the first episode of cocktail diplomacy between Cuba and the United States. And it was very interesting for me in my research. I went to this man, Carlos Lechuga, in Cuba to interview him about this history. And I said, so how did this start? He said, well, you know, the United States approached us and asked us to engage in this diplomacy. And then, of course, we interviewed, in my interview with Bundy and others that were still alive, they said, well, Cuba asked us, reached out to us. And so both sides were saying, well, we were approached. And the truth of the matter is, it was this extraordinarily, the chutzpah, this extraordinary woman, Lisa Howard, who wanted to see this, wanted to see movement in U.S.-Cuban relations. She went to Lechuga and she said, the United States wants to talk to you. The opportunity is at my house, my Central Park apartment, tonight at a cocktail party. And she went to Atwood and she said, Cuba wants to talk to you. Get permission from Adlai Stevenson to come to my house and meet with Carlos Lechuga, kind of under the guise of a cocktail party. You guys can go off in the corner. And that's what they did. They went off in the corner. They talked. Bill Atwood told Lechuga that the CIA was basically running Cuba policy. Lechuga said, you know, Fidel would like to meet with somebody. You could fly secretly down to Cuba. And this started in the fall of 1963, a countdown of diplomacy. There's an extraordinary audio tape on November 5th of Bundy going into Kennedy's office, and the taping system goes on, and Bundy says, you know, the Cubans have reached out to Atwood and they've offered a secret meeting in Cuba. Should we send him? And Kennedy says, yeah, you know, we could send him, but we have to privatize him. We have to create plausible denial. Maybe we should take him off the payroll at the UN a month before he goes, so that if it leaks that he went to Cuba, we can say that he went on his own. And that was the classic, you know, discussion for using back-channel intermediaries. There's a lot of episodes of that exact kind of scenario in this book, Back Channel to Cuba, using people who could be plausibly denied if it ever leaked that they went, and Atwood was going to be the first. This tape is on the website of the National Security Archive. It's extraordinary tape if you want to listen to it. I couldn't play it here. No, Atwood did a chronology of his meetings and phone calls with the Cubans. The date of this summary is so extraordinary. November 22nd, 1963. He's clearly written this and sent it over before he gets the news that the president has been shot in Dallas. And that's the most extraordinary thing about this history, is that there was this buildup of momentum right in the last, literally, first the last kind of 3 weeks of the president's life, and then the last 72 hours of his life. He authorizes Bundy to proceed with Atwood. Atwood goes to Lisa Howard's apartment and gets on the phone with Fidel Castro's top deputy. Her apartment had become kind of communication central. They agree that there's going to be a meeting, that Cuba is going to send an agenda to the United Nations. The United States doesn't really decide. Kennedy decides he'd prefer to have a preliminary meeting at the UN, and he needs to know what the agenda is, what Cuba's ready to discuss before he's going to authorize Atwood to go secretly to Cuba. And so all of these events start to pile up, including 2 events in the last 72 hours. Kennedy gives a big speech to the Inter-American Press Corps on Cuba, in which he kind of issues kind of as subtly the conditions, where he basically says, you know, if Cuba did this and this, we really think we could live with the Cuban Revolution. And it was intended to send a message, knowing that these other things were going on. And then, of course, Jean Daniel goes to Cuba carrying this message. He arrives on the 20th of November. Meets with Fidel for the first time, conveys the message. Then they have a second meeting on the 22nd and continue to talk about this. And they meet, obviously having an animated conversation, and Fidel is extremely positive about Kennedy's message. He starts talking about how Kennedy could become the most famous president in history because he would be the one that understood that the socialist bloc and the capitalist blocs could actually live together and coexist together on kind of equal footing in a peaceful way and not in a way of aggression. Now, of course, this raises all sorts of issues of what-ifs. Lisa Howard went back to Cuba in February of 1964. Fidel talked to her and talked on camera a little bit obliquely about the whole issue of Kennedy. And later he would tell the sons of Robert Kennedy that it's unfortunate that things happened as they did and that the president could not do what he wanted to do. It's a dramatic history. It's a history that certainly is relevant to the Kennedy administration. Its relevance to the assassination is for all of you to determine. But if you want as many details as you can possibly find on it, the Kennedy chapter in this book is now available. Thank you.
Excuse me, is the breakout room ready now? Another? No. I first need to know whether the breakout room. Because I don't know the canon. That's what he said. Yes.
Go ahead, David. David, step a little closer.
David Kaiser. Professor Kornblum. I've researched this a lot myself, and I would be delighted to be able to say that I found what you did, but it isn't really what I found. It's a question of interpretation and emphasis. And I just want to take a second to get it across. To begin with, you started with those remarks of Kennedy's in March. But in April, the President had a documented change of heart, oddly enough, as a result of a crisis in Laos, where things were heating up. And he said in an NSC meeting, why are we easing up in Cuba when Khrushchev is screwing us on Laos, or words to that effect. And that got the planning for a mixture of covert action and new Cuban groups training and
Yes,
Central America and so on.
autonomous operations. Which
Right, that got that going again. But, and the other thing I do want to mention is I would have loved to say that this was about to be a success because William Atwood was both a close personal friend of my family and essentially a second father to me. But the data on how his proposal was received, which I want to quote from, is, shows me something else. And allow me to quote just a second. When McGeorge Bundy brought Atwood's initiative before the special group on November 5th, those present, including McCone, Ewell Alexis Johnson from State, Vance from Defense, and the Attorney General, agreed that it would be better for Atwood to return to private life before meeting again with Castro, and they suggested that Vallejo fly to Mexico City, perhaps to meet with U.S. Ambassador Thomas Mann, who would not have been interested. RFK also argued that Castro would have to end subversive activities and arrange the evacuation of all Soviet troops before the United States could discuss a détente. On November 12th, Bundy telephoned Atwood in New York after speaking with the President, the conversation which you referenced. I called this afternoon with William Atwood and told him that at the President's instruction I was conveying this message orally and not by cable. I told him that the President hoped he would get in touch with Vallejo to report that it did not seem practicable to us at this stage to send an American official to Cuba, and that we would prefer to begin with a visit by Vallejo to the U.S., where Atwood would be glad to see him and to listen to any messages he might bring.
And I did say that.
Etc. Yes.
David,
I'm sorry.
You're very limited. I'm
All
awfully
right.
sorry.
All right.
Like,
and I think the evidence is, and it's followed up in the quote, that in fact they didn't actively want to pursue this at this time, that it was being held as an option to pursue at some point down the road, and meanwhile, as I say, the planning for the assassination of Castro, new landings in Cuba, some mix of events that would enable them to bring the overthrow of Castro about was continuing apace and at the highest levels.
Well, I can only say what actually happened in those final days, which was that, of course, in the bureaucracy was 90%, 95% against this. And Robert Kennedy tended to say one thing in bigger meetings and other things privately. He had his own meeting with Atwood and was cautiously open to the idea of initiative with Cuba. The President is on tape in his own office, not saying don't send him, I don't want to have anything to do with Fidel Castro, but saying let's explore how we could do this safely. And the safety steps were, the cautious steps were, let's not just send somebody off without knowing what we're going to talk about. Let's get an agenda from the Cubans sent up. Let's have a preliminary meeting in New York, and then let's see how we go from there. And in fact, Atwood takes those instructions and in a telephone call with Vallejo on the 19th of November, very late, early in the morning, like 2 o'clock in the morning, at Lisa Howard's house, conveys that very information, that they're open to this, they need an agenda, they need to know what the Cubans want to talk about, and he can't go to Cuba safely, securely right now, but there's alternatives. And the amazing kind of irony and coincidence and, for me, kind of sadness of this extraordinary history, besides the fact that the President of the United States is assassinated, is at the very moment that he's assassinated, Castro's agenda is being flown up to New York and given to Lechuga. It's a document that I have not been able to recover from the Cuban government yet. I'm still working on it, but it's one of those pivotal pieces of evidence that we need in order to see what Cuba felt it was ready to talk about at that very time. There is no doubt, though, that the assassination of the President of the United States aborted a series of efforts on both sides, Cuba and the United States, to move towards some type of official face-to-face meeting to discuss their differences.
Paul Kunstler, Washington, D.C. Peter, you mentioned McGeorge Bundy in your remarks. Do you have any knowledge that McGeorge Bundy might have had prior knowledge of President Kennedy's assassination?
I have no idea of that whatsoever.
Go ahead. Over here. Go ahead.
My name is Irving Lee. Given the extraordinary presentation by Mr. Vecchiana yesterday, it dawned on me the question I didn't get a chance to ask was, if rapprochement actually did take place, what will the ramifications be? And I asked that question to the translator yesterday. He said the Castro would have been gone. And, you know, we're all speculating, of course, but the question I ask you is, if the rapprochement was able to take place, what changes would have been made? Would it have been a split within the Cuban government on this question? Or would Castro and Che would have been broken apart by this rapprochement? What's your opinions on that? And what would have changed? Would the embargo be eliminated, for example?
Che Guevara was actually Castro's first emissary to the to talk to a U.S. official, and had this famous discussion with Richard Goodwin in Montevideo in August of 1961, where Che, you know, on behalf of Fidel, said, you know, thank you for the Bay of Pigs. You turned us into a little aggrieved country into an equal.
And here's a box of cigars.
And here's a big box of cigars.
That's right.
Yeah, we have an article drawn from the book coming out in Cigar Aficionado in a couple of weeks called Cigar Diplomacy, how Fidel Castro used cohibas as a weapon of peace.
Right.
And so you can read about the Che Guevara story there.
Nice.
But, you know, the idea that there was a huge difference of opinion between Fidel and Che Guevara on these issues, I think, is not accurate. It's something that Lisa Howard in her reports and others who met with Castro played up when they came home, but it's not at all clear that they themselves had any in-depth knowledge of the relationship between Che and Fidel. Certainly there were more hardliners in the Cuban government who were opposed to any effort to improve relations with the United States, but, you know, Fidel Castro held all the cards and all the power in Cuba at that time, and certainly almost all the way up till 2006 when he was forced to retire from illness. And if he had wanted to do this, he would have done it. I don't think it would have ended his regime in any way. I think it would have validated the revolution.
Gentlemen, we need to make the most efficient use of time as possible. So, Bill, go ahead. And then Dr. Newman.
Bill Simpich, I wanted to ask if you had anything on the background of the arrest of the Cuban officials in New York in November '62 that were used later to swap by Donovan for the CIA guys in April '63.
Yes.
And I asked because they were supposedly doing a terror plot to blow up Macy's and Bloomingdale's in November '62. And Angleton said later that they were going after military facilities. I'm going, there's some disconnect here.
Well, I welcome the researchers in the room who have spent a lot of time, more time than me, looking at those records. I think they're important, they're fascinating. It's a perplexing issue. Were these guys arrested for no good reason and charged falsely so that the United States would have some bargaining power directly on these for a prisoner swap? Or, and this is possible, did Castro send these guys? They had arrived in October. Did he send them as part of his contingency planning on the missile crisis? He certainly was worried that the United States was going to attack Cuba, and perhaps wanted to put in place, kind of an effort in New York to be able to respond. But they arrived at a very odd time. In October of 1962, amidst great tensions with the United States, and they were quickly, arrested. So, in the context, of course, with the missile crisis and all, makes it very difficult to know whether, just by rote, the U.S. government decided they were going to arrest people who were just coming from Cuba at that time because they might be terrorists, or whether they actually had some plot.
Dr. Newman?
Yeah, hi, Peter. I just want to expand on your answer to the question about McGeorge Bundy having advanced knowledge of the assassination. I think I agree with your response, and I would add that if you look at the drafting process of NSAM 273, which McGeorge Bundy wrote, and I spoke to him about this, I interviewed him about it, it's really clear that even though they were thinking of escalating in Vietnam in various ways, that he put language in there that he thought that his boss, President Kennedy, could approve. And this was the day before. So it doesn't look like he expected the president to be dead. It really looks like McGeorge Bundy thought that he was writing a document the day on the 21st that John Kennedy would be alive to see.
Dr. Aguilar, last question.
Yeah, last question. Just a point about the business of there perhaps having been, to address Dr. Kaiser's point about there having been 2 tracks. Peter Dale Scott has made the point that governments are always pursuing 2, 3, sometimes even 4 tracks. And so the fact that you can document that something was being done does not mean that something else was being done at the same time. That's the way it always works, and Peter knows that, having been a Canadian diplomat and having worked at high-level political circles himself for much of his career.
No, McGeorge Bundy actually told me that he was they had he had a word for it. It wasn't multi-tracking, but it was something similar to that. And he certainly acknowledged that they were still looking at CIA operations, although, truth be told, they were limited. The autonomous operations was supposed to kind of distance the CIA from these exiles and let them go off and do their own thing so that we would be somewhat less involved. But the point was that Kennedy also wanted to explore a different route, and that route was under serious exploration at the moment that he was killed. Thank you for coming.
I have one question. Can I ask you one question?
No, not now. Sorry, we're close. I'm awfully sorry.
All right.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been amazing. October the 1st, back channel to Cuba.